Good King Harry. She said those 3 words about her younger son with evident delight, turned them into private family shorthand, kept them alive in the household vocabulary across years of nursery afternoons and school holidays. She also, as has been widely reported by those who knew her, called that same boy stupid. Same mother, same son. The question isn't which one was real. Both, apparently, were operating simultaneously. What it means when a woman holds those 2 assessments at once, aimed at the same child, and what that combination deposits in a boy growing up inside one of the most scrutinized families in the world, is what the decades since Diana's death have been slowly, irrevocably answering. Diana played favorites with her sons, this essay's central contention, one contested by some accounts, including those of royal author James Patterson, whose reporting finds her actively working to shield both boys from precisely that dynamic. Not in any simple, consciously deliberate way. The evidence suggests she genuinely tried to shield both boys from the institutional hierarchy that was already sorting them before they could understand what sorting meant. Intentions and outcomes are separate categories of fact, and the psychological inheritance she left each son was asymmetric in ways the years since her death have made increasingly difficult to ignore. William absorbed what was finest in her. Harry absorbed what was most volatile. The rift playing out today, the silence between 2 brothers who once shared a nursery in Kensington Palace, is the direct, predictable result of that divided legacy. By the time William arrived in June 1982 and Harry followed in September 1984, the Wales marriage had already become something closer to a formal arrangement than a living partnership. 2 people sharing a diary, a palace, and a public face while conducting in private something resembling an armed truce. Charles and Diana were, by the early 1980s, people who had fundamentally misread each other at the altar and had no institutional means of correcting the error. The Wales household, Kensington Palace in London, became the stage for separate performances of a marriage rather than the actual thing. In that environment, 2 boys were absorbing the emotional architecture of their household during precisely the years when human beings form their most durable impressions of what family means, what institutions cost, and what the price of belonging to an extraordinary one actually looks like. Children absorb the mood before they absorb the meaning. These 2 were immersed in it during the years when impressions go deepest, before they had language for what they were witnessing, before they had any frame of reference for what a different kind of home might feel like. What Diana brought into that household was genuine and, in the most specific sense of the word, remarkable. Her capacity for human connection was so immediate and so unguarded that it struck people as structurally different from anything the royal family had previously produced in public. She walked through AIDS wards when the tabloids were still treating the disease as a divine punishment, sat at bedsides, held hands, made eye contact in the way that tells a person they are being seen rather than merely visited. She walked through the ruined landmine fields of Angola. Her empathy wasn't a media strategy, at least not in its origins. It came from somewhere specific, a childhood spent feeling overlooked by parents absorbed in their own unhappiness, an adolescence convinced she was permanently inadequate, a marriage in which she felt systematically erased. She recognized suffering because she had lived inside its precise texture for most of her formative years. That recognition was her most authentic quality and the most extraordinary thing she put into the world. Alongside that gift lived its shadow. Diana had a structural inability to separate her personal grievances from her public obligations, the inevitable product of a woman who had been genuinely hurt by the institution and couldn't believe it was worth preserving on terms other than her own. The pattern it produced was consistent. Whenever the institution failed to honor her needs, she reached for a weapon, and her preferred weapon was always the press. She didn't merely tolerate coverage. She cultivated it, directed it, managed it with the strategic intelligence of someone who had understood far earlier than the palace credited that she possessed something the institution couldn't manufacture: the unconditional affection of the public. That affection was worth real leverage, and she knew it, and she used it. In November 1995, she gave a BBC Panorama interview, a declaration of war delivered through the medium of tearful vulnerability. The palace's response made them look exactly as she had described them. Any institutional rebuttal confirmed the characterization. The trap was architectural, and she had designed it, understanding intuitively that an institution defending itself against a charge of coldness will always appear cold in the act of defending. Those two realities, the woman who could walk into a leper colony and give a stranger the specific, particular gift of being fully seen, and the woman who gave a journalist access to her most devastating private grievances for national broadcast, lived inside the same person simultaneously. Her sons received one half each. She called William DDG, drop-dead gorgeous, warm, adoring, unmistakably affectionate, and fundamentally about William's external impact, the impression he made on the world from the outside. Harry's private label was GKH, Good King Harry. Those two nicknames operate in entirely different registers. DDG describes what William is. GKH describes what Harry might become. One is grounded in the present. The other is oriented toward a future. Diana chose her words with real intentionality, even in affectionate shorthand. Anyone who has listened to the Morton recordings understands that about her. The asymmetry carries weight. The origin of Good King Harry has been documented through royal sources and confirmed by royal author James Patterson. That nickname emerged from a specific childhood exchange between the brothers. William, apparently carrying an early awareness of what his inheritance would demand, reportedly said he didn't want to be king. Harry's response was immediate, cheerful, and entirely characteristic of who he would grow into. "Well, I'll do the job instead of you then." Diana adopted the nickname with evident delight. GKH, Good King Harry. It entered the family's private vocabulary and stayed there. Remarks that are purely passing jokes tend to be repeated once, smiled at, and quietly retired. Any nickname that persists, crystallizing into known shorthand among those in Diana's inner circle across years, is doing something more structural than its surface tone might suggest, even if the person using it has never consciously examined what. Diana may well have just been joking. Harry was a small boy cheerfully volunteering for one of the most scrutinized roles in the world, with precisely zero understanding of what he was signing up for, and his mother's adoption of the nickname was a mother's delighted response to a small boy's bravado. Parents repeat exactly this kind of remark for years, kept alive in the family vocabulary not because it carries constitutional intent, but because it captures something irresistible about a child at a specific age. Diana's warmth with both boys was genuine and consistently documented. The DDG nickname for William demonstrates she applied these private labels with love and lightness, rather than dynastic calculation. That interpretation is entirely reasonable, and dismissing it as naive would be a form of dishonesty this argument declines to practice. Granted, she may well have been joking, and even if she wasn't, even if she meant every syllable of it, it made no practical difference at all. Queen Elizabeth II made certain of that. The line ran through William from the moment of his birth in June 1982. No nickname, however affectionately repeated across the Kensington Palace nursery years, was going to move that line in any document Elizabeth was prepared to countersign. Whether Diana was serious or playful, the institution had already rendered the constitutional question moot before it had time to become anything else. Both sides of this debate can be simultaneously correct and simultaneously beside the practical point. The psychological deposit in Harry, though, that is a separate matter entirely. Children receive repeated, intimate, affectionate shorthand as fact rather than as irony. They absorb content, not register. The content of Good King Harry, received by a boy who was simultaneously positioned by every other element of his institutional environment as second, as spare, lands differently than it does when recounted as a charming anecdote at 30 years remove. Paul Burrell, who worked in the Wales household, recounted a specific domestic detail from those years. One of the nannies reportedly told William he needed 3 sausages to grow big and strong because he would be king one day, with Harry receiving 2. Whether the nanny meant it seriously is almost beside the point. That is the layered institutional messaging Harry was receiving from every direction, while his mother was privately telling him he would be good King Harry. The gap between those 2 messages, one from the institution pressing him down, one from the person whose opinion mattered most pressing him toward something larger, was always going to produce something. What it produced is the man we can now observe. As has been widely reported by those in Diana's circle, circulating in the biographical tradition surrounding her parenting, referenced across years of royal commentary, Diana privately expressed serious concern about Harry's academic and intellectual development. The characterization that has entered the record is stark. The word, stupid. The precise primary source can't be confirmed from available evidence, and that must be stated rather than glossed over. This isn't a verified direct quote. It's attributed as widely reported, as coming from those who knew her, and those qualifiers hold throughout. Even carefully hedged, the contradiction holds. A mother who privately expresses serious concern about a child's intellectual capacity while simultaneously encoding an aspiration to kingship into his private name, those 2 positions, held at the same time, reveal something neither label alone could show. Fitness to reign requires, among other things, precisely the intellectual faculty Diana reportedly doubted Harry possessed: strategic patience, the capacity to carry private grief whilst maintaining public composure, the ability to look at an institution frustrating him in the moment and understand why its structures matter beyond that specific frustration. What these 2 characterizations reveal, placed together, is a woman mapping something intensely personal onto her younger son, seeing in him her own fire, her own rebellion, her own unfinished conviction that the institution had been wrong about her, and presenting that self-recognition to him as something resembling destiny. She was projecting a war, not identifying a king's qualities. William's approach to public life maps directly onto Diana's most enduring qualities. The Heads Together mental health campaign, launched with Catherine and Harry in 2016, drew explicit lines to Diana's anti-stigma work, her willingness to be physically present with people in the most vulnerable circumstances, without retreating behind the glass of formal royal distance. Heads Together measurably shifted the public conversation in Britain around mental illness, precisely because the personal investment behind it was legible and specific. He channeled her gift through institutional structures rather than against them, honoring her most enduring quality whilst correcting her most destructive pattern. His press management tells an equally precise story. William maintains defined boundaries and deploys media access on his schedule and his terms. Facing genuine tabloid intrusion into his private life, real and documented, he pursued legal action through proper channels, quietly, and without narrating the process publicly as a crusade. Diana's press strategy was brilliant and self-destructive in equal measure. She wielded the tool with formidable skill, but couldn't govern what it set in motion once the institutional relationship fractured around her. William watched what that produced and built his own media approach on entirely different foundations. Catherine and William's marriage is where the comparison sharpens most directly. Whatever difficulties have arisen across years of extraordinary public pressure have been managed privately, not surfaced in interviews as evidence that the palace is incapable of accommodating their humanity, not narrated as the institution's failure. Diana's marriage to Charles became a study in what happens when two people who have fundamentally misread each other are locked inside an institution that can't accommodate either of their natures. William built his own marriage on the evidence of that study, and the structure has held under pressures that would have detonated many others. Harry's column maps onto the other half of Diana's character with a fidelity that, once noticed, resists any explanation that doesn't include the word inheritance. Diana, in 1992, secretly tape-recorded conversations with Andrew Morton that became Diana, Her True Story, published that year, a document of personal grievance against the institution she was still officially representing, disseminated through a trusted intermediary at careful remove, with a narrative positioning the speaker as authentic victim against cold institutional machinery that couldn't respond without appearing to confirm the characterization, maintained under plausible deniability until after the divorce, confirmed eventually by the recordings that couldn't be denied. Harry, 30 years later, authorized and then personally wrote Spare, constructed with a professional publishing apparatus timed for maximum global impact, narrated throughout with an insistence on personal suffering and institutional indifference that is, in its structural architecture, the same operation Diana ran in 1992. The specific grievances differ. The blueprint is identical. The Oprah interview of March 2021 deepens the parallel to a point where observation replaces argument. Diana's November 1995 Panorama interview was a declaration of war delivered through the medium of tearful vulnerability, pitched with such precision that any institutional response confirmed everything Diana had implied. Harry and Meghan's appearance in March 2021 deployed the same mechanism: tearful disclosures, claims of deliberate institutional cruelty, the positioning of themselves as people who had simply felt too much to survive inside an institution, incapable of accommodating their humanity. The palace was left holding an inadequate response, again, for the same structural reason. Diana was nearly a quarter-century dead before Harry sat in that chair. She had nonetheless modeled the method with maximum cultural impact during his most formative years, and the absorption was complete. According to widely documented accounts, on the evening of August 30th, 1997, hours before the crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, Diana telephoned Richard Kay, the Daily Mail journalist she had cultivated as her primary trusted press contact across years of highly deliberate media management. Kay was her conduit for stories she wanted placed, her instrument for the institutional press operation she had been running throughout the 1990s. He is also the interviewer in the original video at the center of this analysis, the man now discussing her legacy on camera, who knew Diana more intimately, in a media relations sense, than almost any other reporter in Fleet Street. Harry, subsequently, has made the press's role in his mother's death a central grievance in his public account of his own suffering. In Spare, in the Oprah interview, in legal proceedings and public statements across years of sustained institutional complaint, presenting himself as a man defined by the photographers who chased that car. Both propositions can be simultaneously true. The paparazzi's pursuit that night was reckless, and the woman in that car was on the phone with one of Fleet Street's best-connected royal correspondents in her final hours. Diana's relationship with the press was never the simple story of victim and predator that Harry's account requires. She cultivated that relationship strategically across nearly a decade, and the account Harry inherited flattens a complexity that tells a more honest story about his mother. That flattening is itself a form of inheritance, the portion of the truth he was given rather than the whole of it. Elizabeth II inherited the crown in circumstances that had already demonstrated, at devastating personal cost, the specific consequences of permitting personal feeling to override constitutional obligation. Her uncle had abdicated for love. The fallout installed a man on the throne whose health the weight of it broke and whose reign it shortened. From the beginning of her own 7-decade reign, Elizabeth grasped something Diana genuinely couldn't internalize, and that Harry has apparently never internalized. A constitutional monarchy endures through the consistency of its structures, not through any individual's personal magnetism, however genuine and extraordinary that magnetism might be. The personality is temporary. The line is what outlasts it. The succession was, for Elizabeth, a constitutional given of the same foundational solidity as any legal principle that has survived 8 centuries of testing. William's primacy was established at his birth in June 1982. No affectionate nickname repeated across the Kensington Palace nursery years was going to move that line in any document Elizabeth was prepared to countersign, or any conversation she was prepared to entertain. She had watched the Wales marriage dissolve in real time, watched Diana's press campaigns dismantle the palace's carefully managed public narrative, and understood precisely what damage the conflation of personal grievance with public platform can inflict on an institution whose durability depends on being seen as something larger than any individual personality. Her relationship with Harry was warm in his early years, and grew more complicated as his adult choices moved progressively further from the institutional values she had spent 7 decades embodying. The discipline she enforced wasn't indifference. It was the application of a principle she had held constant through things considerably more destabilizing than a maternal nickname, through abdication crises, through wars, through the dissolution of an empire, through the most scrutinized family implosion in modern British history. Elizabeth also resolves the counter-narrative in the most practical terms imaginable. Whether Diana was serious about good King Harry or entirely playful, both answers, examined fully, arrive at the same destination. Elizabeth had already rendered the constitutional question moot. Both factions can be correct. Both arrive together at the same place. A boy who grew up carrying a phrase as personal mythology with no institutional path to the reality it described. The tragedy, the specific, precise tragedy in this story, is that Diana almost certainly never set out to divide her inheritance asymmetrically. Everything documented about her approach to raising both boys suggests she was actively trying to protect them from the institutional hierarchies already working on them before they were old enough to understand what sorting meant. The nicknames came from warmth. The sausage story came from a nanny. By all accounts, she gave both boys as much of herself as she could, trying to ensure that neither would feel the cold arithmetic of succession pressing on him before he was ready to bear its weight. The division happened anyway. It wasn't between her intentions for them. It was between the parts of herself she could integrate and the parts she never could. William received the Diana who had learned, through her own suffering, to translate that suffering into genuine connection, who could walk into a children's cancer ward and be fully, authentically present in a way the institution had spent centuries trying to prevent. Harry received the Diana who reached for a weapon whenever the institution closed in, who never resolved her conviction that she was owed more than it was prepared to give, and who acted on that conviction with increasing frequency and decreasing restraint across the last years of her life. She gave both boys everything she had. Not everything she had was worth keeping. Good King Harry, a mother's delight at a small boy's bravado, turned into private shorthand that lasted years. And, as has been widely reported, the same mother privately doubting the intellectual foundations the word king would have required. Those two characterizations don't cancel each other. Held together, they describe a woman who loved her son deeply, saw herself in him vividly, and pressed that self-recognition onto him with enough force that he carried it into adulthood as a kind of mandate. A mandate for a throne the institution would never offer, and a war the institution had already made permanent arrangements to survive. William inherited Diana's purpose. Harry inherited her wounds. Queen Elizabeth, who understood that an institution can't be sustained on a mother's projection, ensured the line held. Diana played favorites with her sons, and this, the silence between two brothers, the global media campaigns, the institution that absorbed the impact and kept moving. This is the result. Subscribe for more stories like this.